A heavy, suffocating silence fell over Station 42, spreading like a contagion to the neighboring machines. One by one, the looms connected to the same drive shaft groaned to a halt. The silence was worse than the noise. In the Blackwood mill, silence meant lost profit, and lost profit meant someone had to bleed. The heavy boots of the overlooker, Mr. Grissom, thudded against the floor. Grissom was a man built like a meat hook, sharp, lean, and rust-colored. He carried a heavy willow switch in one hand and a ledger in the other. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the tangled ruin of the silk. "Station 42, Grissom whispered, his voice a dry rasp that carried further than a shout. "Thorn, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Elias said, his voice cracking. He kept his eyes fixed on Grissom's polished boots. To look up was a sign of defiance. "Do you know how many yards of silk were lost in that 1 second of your distraction?" Grissom asked, stepping closer. The smell of cheap gin and stale tobacco rolled off him. 4 yards, 12 shillings, more than you earn in a month of flicking and clearing. Elias said nothing. There was no excuse that would matter. He couldn't say he was looking at a bird. In this room, birds didn't exist. Nature didn't exist. There was only the output. "Hands out," Grissom commanded. Elias extended his hands. They were stained dark with oil and scarred with dozens of tiny nicks from the thread. Grissom didn't strike Elias with the switch, not yet. Instead, he grabbed Elias's right thumb, the one that hit the lever every second of every day. He squeezed it until the bone felt like it would snap. "The machine is the master, Thorn. You are the apprentice. If the apprentice fails the master, the apprentice must be punished so he remembers his place in the rhythm." Grissom signaled to 2 fixers, men whose only job was to repair the machines and the men who broke them. They pushed Elias aside and began tearing at the tangled silk with serrated knives. They didn't care about the loom's delicate parts. They only cared about speed. Every minute the line was down was a minute deducted from the pay of every worker in the row. Elias felt the heat of 100 angry eyes on his back. His co-workers, the very people he spent 14 hours with each day, didn't look at him with sympathy. They looked at him with cold, simmering rage. His mistake meant they would be staying an extra hour tonight to make up the quota. It meant their meager dinner of watery gruel and stale bread would be even colder when they got home. By the time the loom was cleared and the drive belt re-engaged, Elias's hands were shaking. This was the greatest danger of the same thing all day job. Once the rhythm was broken, it was nearly impossible to find it again. The muscle memory had been fractured. Left, clear, right, flick. He tried to start again, but he was conscious of it now. Before the accident, he was a ghost in a machine. Now he was a man trying to imitate a machine. He was aware of the weight of his own arm. He was aware of the itch on his nose. He was aware of the burning in his lungs. "One more mistake, Thorn," Grissom shouted over the returning roar, "and you'll find yourself at the gates. And we both know there are 50 men standing in the rain right now who would kill for the privilege of standing where you are." It was true. The Reserve Army of Labor, the newspapers called them. Desperate men from the countryside whose farms had failed, standing outside the factory gates every morning, hoping for someone to die or get fired. Elias forced his eyes to lop on the shuttle. He tried to disappear again. He tried to become the iron. But the bird song was still echoing in his head, a beautiful, haunting melody that made the clanging of the mill sound like a funeral dirge. He realized then, with a sinking horror, that the repetition hadn't just been his job, it had been his protection. By doing the same thing every day, he had shielded his mind from the reality of his existence. Now that the shield was cracked, the reality was pouring in. He looked down the long line of Station 42, 43, 44, all the way to the end of the hall. Hundreds of arms rising and falling in perfect, horrific unison. It looked like a giant, many-legged insect twitching in its death throes. As the afternoon light faded into a murky orange through the high, soot-stained clerestory windows, Elias felt a new sensation. It wasn't the usual exhaustion. It was a flickering spark of rebellion. Not the kind that starts riots, but the kind that makes a man wonder, what happens if I don't flick the lever? But then he remembered Grissom's grip on his thumb. He remembered the empty bellies of his younger sisters at home. Left, clear, right, flick. The rhythm resumed, but the man inside the rhythm was changing.
By the time the moon rose over the jagged rooftops of the industrial district, the Blackwood Mill had become a fever dream of steam and shadows. The oil lamps were lit, casting long, flickering silhouettes of the machinery against the brick walls. To a stranger, it might have looked like a dance. To Elias, it was a slow-motion execution. The extra hour of labor, the penalty for his distraction, was taking its toll. His muscles weren't just aching, they were vibrating. This was the stage of the shift the workers called the hum. It occurred when the body became so accustomed to the vibration of the factory floor that even if the machine stopped, the person would continue to shake. Left, clear, right, flick. Elias focused on his breathing. He tried to time his inhales with the leftward swing and his exhales with the right. It was a desperate attempt to regain the mechanical zen he had lost. But something was different now. The bird song had acted as a key, unlocking a door in his mind that he had spent years trying to bolt shut. He began to notice things he had ignored for the sake of his sanity. He noticed the smell, not just the grease and the wool, but the smell of human desperation. It was the scent of unwashed bodies, of sickness held at bay by sheer necessity, and the metallic tang of blood from a dozen small accidents down the line. He noticed the sound of Station 43. Sarah, the woman who had warned him, was coughing. It was a wet, heavy sound, the white lung caused by breathing in fine cotton fibers for a decade. She didn't stop her work to cough. She coughed in time with the machine. Cough, clear, flick, cough, clear, flick. She was dying in the rhythm, and the machine didn't care. The machine would keep moving long after her lungs finally gave out, and by the next morning, a new Sarah would be standing there, doing the exact same thing. A movement in the rafters caught his eye. It was the bird again, or perhaps another one. It was trapped. It fluttered against the high glass windows, its wings beating a frantic, irregular rhythm against the panes. It was a chaotic sound, a direct insult to the perfect timing of the factory. Elias watched it out of the corner of his eye. The bird wanted out. It didn't want to be part of the pulse. "Keep your eyes down, Thorne," a voice hissed. It was the boy from earlier, the bobbin scavenger. He was currently huddled in the narrow gap between Elias's station and the next, waiting for the signal to dive under the moving belts. "The bird," Elias whispered, his lips barely moving. "It's trying to get to the sky." "There ain't no sky in here," the boy muttered, his eyes never leaving the floor. "There's only the thread. Look at the thread, or Grissom will have your hide." But Elias couldn't. The monotony had been broken, and in its place a terrifying clarity had emerged. He began to calculate. If he did this for another 20 years, if he survived the accidents, the white lung, and the starvation, how many times would he flick that lever? He did the math in his head. 50 million times. 50 million flicks of a silver lever to produce miles of silk that he would never be allowed to touch, let alone wear. He was a ghost, a phantom limb of a steam engine. Suddenly, the primary shuttle feed on his machine began to hiss. A gasket was leaking steam. Usually this was a minor issue, something the fixers would handle during the brief Sunday maintenance, but tonight the steam was venting directly on the silver lever. Every time Elias reached out to flick, a jet of scalding white vapor blasted his knuckles. Left, clear, right, flick, burn, left, clear, right, flick, burn. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, refusing to cry out. If he stopped, he'd be fired. If he complained, he'd be fined. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He adapted. He shifted his grip, trying to use the very tip of his fingernail to catch the lever, avoiding the steam. But the heat was intensifying. The skin on his hand was turning a raw, angry red, blistering in the humid air. The pain was a new kind of rhythm. It kept him awake. It kept him present. For the first time in years, he wasn't a machine. He was a man in agony, and that agony was proof that he was still alive. As the final whistle blew at 8 p.m., the machines didn't just stop, they sighed. The sudden absence of noise was a physical blow, making Elias stumble forward. His hand was a ruin of blisters and oil. He looked at the silver lever, now quiet and cold. He hated it. He hated the way it sat there, indifferent to the flesh it had consumed. "Thorne," Grissom's voice boomed from the end of the hall. "Back at 4:30. Don't be late. And wrap that hand. I won't have blood staining the silk. Blood is harder to wash out than oil." Elias walked out of the mill and into the cold night air. The soot-heavy rain began to fall, cooling his burned hand. He didn't head straight for the tenements. Instead, he stood by the iron gates, watching the last of the reserve army wander away into the fog. He looked up at the high windows of the mill. The bird was still in there. He could hear its faint, tired chirping from behind the glass. It had stopped fighting. It was sitting on a beam, waiting for the machines to start again, waiting to be part of the rhythm because it had forgotten how to be anything else. Elias gripped his burned hand and felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. He had done the same thing every day for 3 years. Tomorrow, he would walk back through those gates. He would stand at Station 42. He would clear and he would flick. But he wouldn't do it as a part of the machine. He would do it as a saboteur of his own soul. He began to realize that if the machine needed him to be a gear to function, then he held a power the masters didn't realize. A gear can choose to strip its teeth. He walked home, the hum still vibrating in his bones, already counting the seconds until the 4:30 bell. The 4:30 a.m. bell was no longer a wake-up call. It was a summons to a battlefield. Elias rose from his straw pallet, his body screaming in protest. His right hand was a bloated, angry mess of blisters. He had wrapped it in a strip of greasy rag, but the slightest movement sent bolts of white-hot agony up his arm. He stared at his hand in the dim light of a single tallow candle. It looked like a foreign object, a tool that had been overused and discarded. As he walked toward the Blackwood mill, the rain had turned into a freezing drizzle that turned the soot on the streets into a slick black paste. He noticed the others more clearly now, the repeaters. He saw Old Man Miller, who had spent 30 years feeding raw wool into the carding machines. Miller's body had physically warped. His right shoulder was 4 inches higher than his left, a permanent skeletal tribute to the motion of his reach. He saw the piecers, young girls with nimble fingers who walked miles every day just pacing back and forth in front of the spinning frames, their eyes wide and vacant. They were all biological extensions of the factory's architecture. When the steam whistle blew and the great loom roared to life, Elias felt a wave of nausea. The heat hit him like a physical wall, and the smell of the humid cotton fibers felt like it was coating the inside of his throat with wax. He took his place at Station 42. Left, clear. Right, flick. The first time his blistered thumb hit the silver lever, he nearly lost consciousness. The pain was so sharp it turned his vision white. But the machine didn't care about his nerves. The iron shuttle swung back with the force of a battering ram. If he didn't flick a lever in that exact microsecond, the needle would shatter, the silk would ruin, and Grissom would be there with the switch. He began to count. It was the only way to distance himself from the pain. 1, 2, 3, 60. 1 minute down. 3,600. 1 hour down. By the third hour, a strange phenomenon occurred. The pain reached a plateau where it became a steady, rhythmic thrumming, almost indistinguishable from the vibration of the floor. Elias began to experiment. He found that if he angled his wrist by just 3 degrees, he could use the side of his palm instead of his blistered thumb. It was a small victory, a tiny act of biological engineering against the machine's design. But the machine was a jealous god. Changing his grip meant his clear motion was now a millisecond slower. To compensate, he had to snap his left arm back with more violence. By noon, his left shoulder began to burn with a dull, grinding heat. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, sacrificing one joint to save another. During the brief 10-minute break, where the workers were allowed to eat where they stood, the boy scavenger, Toby, crawled over. He looked at Elias's bandaged hand, which was now weeping yellow fluid through the soot-stained rag. "You won't last the week, Mr. Thorne," the boy whispered, shoving a piece of gray bread into his mouth. "Grissom's already been talking to the fixers about Station 42. He says you're losing the beat." "I haven't missed a cycle yet, Toby," Elias snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "Doesn't matter," Toby said, his eyes darting towards the overlooker's office. "He sees you thinking. A thinker is a lagger is a loss. My brother was a thinker. He started wondering how the steam engine worked. One day he stopped to look at the valves, and the belt took his arm. Now he begs by the docks." Elias looked at the boy, a 10-year-old with the soul of a cynical old man. "I'm not wondering how it works, Toby. I'm wondering why it has to work like this." Toby stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. "It works because the bell rings. That's all there is." The whistle blew again. The 10 minutes of mercy were over. The drive shafts began to spin, and the mill returned to its deafening scream. Elias returned to the rhythm. Left, clear. Right, flick. But Toby's words stayed with him. "He sees you thinking." Elias realized that the most dangerous thing in the mill wasn't the gears or the steam or the fire. It was the gaze of the overlooker. Grissom didn't just manage machines, he managed the absence of thought. As the afternoon stretched into the grueling twilight shift, the heat in the mill reached a breaking point. The steam from the leaking gasket at Station 42 was now a constant plume. Elias was working in a cloud of scalding fog. His clothes were damp, sticking to his skin, and the sart from his sweat was getting into his burns. Then he saw it. A small brass screw on the primary shuttle feed was vibrating loose. It was a tiny thing, no larger than a pea. If it fell out, the shuttle would lose its alignment and tear the silk to shreds. Elias had 2 choices. He could signal for a fixer, which would stop the line, result in a massive fine, and likely get him fired. Or he could try to tighten it with his fingernail in the split second between the clear and the flick. It was a gamble with his fingers as the stakes. He waited for the rhythm. Left, clear. As the arm swung away, he jammed his blistered finger against the screw and twisted. Right, flick. Left, clear. Twist. Right, flick. He did this for 20 cycles. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. On the 21st cycle, the screw caught the thread. It was tight. He had saved the machine. He had saved his job. But as he pulled his hand back, he felt a cold realization. He hadn't saved himself. He had just proven that he was the best possible component for the machine. He was so good at being a gear that he was fixing the machine while it was still running. He looked at the silver lever, then at Grissom, who was watching him from the balcony with a predatory squint. Grissom smiled, a thin, yellow-toothed bearing of gums. He knew. He had seen Elias fix the screw. He knew he had a worker who was now so entwined with the rhythm that he would risk his life to keep it going. Elias felt a hollow sensation in his chest. He was doing the same thing every day, and he was becoming so perfect at it that he was disappearing. He wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. He was Station 42. As the sun set and the lamps were lit,
The bird in the rafters began to chirp again. But this time, Elias didn't look up. He couldn't. If he looked up, he might stop. And if he stopped, he might realize that the only way to truly leave the mill was to let the rhythm break him completely.
The fifth day of the week brought with it the black fog, a weather phenomenon where the factory smoke settled so low into the streets that you couldn't see your own boots. Elias arrived at the mill feeling like a ghost walking through a cloud of charcoal. Inside, the atmosphere was even worse. To combat the dampness of the fog, the boilers had been pushed to their absolute limit. The air was a thick, sweltering soup of steam and cotton dust. Left, clear, right, flick. The rhythm was no longer a choice, it was an anatomical function, like his heartbeat. But today, the sound of the mill had changed. It wasn't just a roar anymore, it was a symphony. Elias began to hear melodies in the clashing of the gears. The high-pitched whine of the spindles was the soprano. The heavy thud of the steam piston in the basement was the bass drum. He realized with a jolt of horror that he was beginning to hallucinate from the sleep deprivation and the heat. He wasn't just doing the job, he was starting to love the rhythm. It was a Stockholm syndrome of the soul. The crushing predictability of the motion offered a strange, dark comfort. In here, there were no choices, no decisions, no world. There was only the next. "Thorn!" Grissom's voice cut through the mechanical music. Elias didn't stop. He couldn't. Left, clear. Right, flick. Grissom leaned over the railing of the station, his face glistening with grease. The master is coming today. Mr. Blackwood himself. He's bringing investors from London. They want to see the efficiency of the human element. If you so much as sneeze out of turn, I'll have you in the street before the steam clears. Elias nodded, his hands never faltering. The human element, that's what they called it. Not people, not workers, but an element like coal or water. An hour later, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. A group of men in top hats and fine wool coats entered. They looked like creatures from another planet. Their clothes were vibrant, deep blues and rich burgundies, colors that didn't exist in the gray world of the repeaters. They walked with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, recoiling from the smell of the very people making them rich. Mr. Blackwood, a man with a beard as white as the cotton he sold, pointed a cane toward Elias's row. "You see, gentlemen," Blackwood's voice carried over the din, amplified by the acoustics of the brick hall. "Through rigorous repetition, we have eliminated the erratic nature of the peasant mind. These men do not think, they do not wander, they are as reliable as the iron they serve." One of the investors, a younger man with a curious expression, stepped closer to Station 42. He watched Elias's hands. Elias felt the man's eyes on his burned, bandaged thumb. For a moment, their eyes met. Elias saw a flicker of something in the investor's gaze. Was it pity? Or was it the way a man looks at a particularly hard-working ox? Doesn't it drive them mad, doing the same motion 10,000 times a day? My God, the sheer boredom would kill a man of spirit. Blackwood chuckled like dry leaves. "Spirit is a luxury of the landed gentry, my boy. For these men, boredom is a safety. It keeps them from the dangerous thoughts that lead to unions and riots. Look at him. He isn't bored. He is perfect." Elias's jaw tightened. Perfect. He wanted to scream. He wanted to reach out and grab the man's silk cravat with his oil-stained hands and show him the spirit that was rotting underneath the repetition. But he didn't. Left, clear, right, flick. The young investor reached out as if to touch the silver lever, curious about the mechanism. "Careful, sir," Grissom barked, stepping forward. But the young man was too slow. He didn't understand the rhythm. He didn't know that in this space, time was carved into razor-sharp slices. As he reached out, the heavy iron shuttle swung back. It would have crushed the investor's hand instantly. Elias saw it happening in slow motion. He had a choice. He could stay in his rhythm, left,
clear, and let the man lose his fingers, or he could break the cycle. Elias lunged. He didn't flick. Instead, he shoved his forearm into the path of the shuttle, using his own limb as a buffer to knock the investor's hand away. The iron shuttle slammed into Elias's arm. The sound of bone snapping was lost in the roar, but the scream that tore from Elias's throat wasn't. He collapsed to the floor, his station falling silent as the safety shear pin finally snapped. The mill didn't stop for his pain. The other stations kept going. Thud, clack, thud, clack. Blackwood hurried the investors away, his face purple with embarrassment. A clumsy worker, an anomaly. Grissom, remove this element immediately. Grissom didn't call a doctor. He didn't offer a hand. He looked at the broken machine, then at Elias, who was cradling his shattered arm on the dirty floor. "You broke the rhythm, Thorne," Grissom said, his voice cold and final. "And you broke the master's silk. You're done." Elias looked up, his vision swimming. For the first time in years, his hands were still. The pain was astronomical, but the repetition was over. He looked at the silver lever, now idle. He had done the same thing every day for 1,000 days, and it had taken a broken bone to finally earn him a moment of silence. "Get out," Grissom spat, "before I charge you for the repair of the loom." Elias stood up, his arm hanging at a sickening angle. He walked toward the exit, his boots echoing on the floorboards. As he passed Station 43, Sarah didn't look up. She couldn't. Her hands were still moving. Left, clear. Right, flick. He was no longer part of the symphony. He was a broken note, discarded and forgotten. But as he stepped out into the black fog, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child. He felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of the next second belonging entirely to him.
The iron gates of the Blackwood mill slammed shut behind Elias with a finality that vibrated in his teeth. Outside, the world was strangely quiet. For 3 years, his ears had been filled with the roar of 10,000 pounds of steam and iron. Now the only sound was the soft patter of rain and the distant, haunting whistle of a locomotive. He stood on the cobblestones, his shattered arm cradled against his chest. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sickening ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He looked at his hands. They were still twitching. Even though the machine was gone, his muscles were still trying to clear and flick. He was a man possessed by a dead rhythm. He began to walk, but his feet didn't know where to go. His entire life had been a circuit, tenement to mill, mill to tenement. Without the 4:30 a.m. bell to guide him, he was a ship without a rudder. As he wandered through the district of Ancoats, he saw the true face of the city he had been too busy to notice. He passed the dwellings of the discarded, crumbling brick hovels where the former repeaters went when they were no longer perfect elements. He saw a man sitting on a stoop, his legs missing, his hands still moving in the phantom motion of a lace-maker. He saw women with the mill shake, their heads jerking in perpetual involuntary nods. The repetition didn't end when you left the mill. It stayed in your marrow. It was a plague of the nervous system. Hunger began to gnaw at him by midday, a sharp reminder that he was no longer on the Blackwood payroll. He had exactly 4 copper pennies in his pocket, the remainder of last week's wages. In the industrial north, 4 pennies bought a loaf of bread and a pint of weak ale, or it brought you a night in a 2-penny hangover, where men slept standing up, draped over a literal rope to keep from falling into the filth of the floor. He found a small apothecary in a side alley, the windows clouded with thick grime. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and formaldehyde. An old man with spectacles thick as bottle glass looked at Elias's arm and sighed. "Mill accident?" the apothecary asked. "The shuttle," Elias rasped. "They always say the shuttle," the man muttered, reaching for a wooden splint and some rough linen. "It'll cost you 2 pence to set it, another penny if you want the willow bark tea for the fever. It won't fix the bone, but it'll stop you from screaming in your sleep." Elias handed over 3 of his 4 pennies. As the man pulled the bone back into alignment, Elias didn't scream. He bit down on a piece of leather and watched the dust motes dancing in a single sliver of sunlight that managed to pierce the shop's window. He realized then that he was seeing the sun for the first time on a Tuesday in 3 years. Usually, by the time the sun was up, he was buried in the belly of the maw. "You're lucky," the apothecary said, wrapping the splint tight. "Most lose the hand entirely, but you're ruined for the looms now. No overlooker will hire a one-armed repeater. You've lost your timing." "I don't want the timing," Elias whispered. "Then you'll starve," the man said simply. "In this city, if you don't move with the engine, you get caught in the gears. There is no middle ground." Elias left the shop, his head light from the willow bark tea. He found himself drawn back toward the mill district as evening approached, not because he wanted to work, but because he didn't know how to exist outside the sound. He stood near the great canal, watching the black water churn. The 8 p.m. whistle blew. A few minutes later, the gates of the Blackwood Mill opened, and the tide of human wreckage poured out. He saw Sarah. She looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched as if she were still trying to fit into the 4-foot space of Station 43. He stepped forward to call her name, but he stopped. She was walking with her eyes fixed on the heels of the man in front of her. She wasn't a person. She was a ghost returning to its grave to wait for the next summons. If he spoke to her, he would be pulling her out of the trance, and that trance was the only thing keeping her from feeling the fire in her lungs. Elias turned away. He couldn't go back to his tenement. He couldn't face the empty room and the ticking of the clock on the mantel, a clock he had bought to ensure he was never late, which now felt like a taunt. He walked toward the edge of the city, where the factories gave way to the great railway yards. Here, a different kind of repetition was happening. Massive locomotives hissed and groaned, their pistons moving with a terrifying, majestic power. He sat on a pile of discarded coal sacks and watched a shunting engine move back and forth, back and forth. It was doing the same thing over and over, but as he watched, he noticed something. The engine didn't have a soul to break. It was made of the same iron as the loom, but it was free to move. It traveled. It carried things. Elias looked at his broken arm and his twitching fingers. He realized that the apothecary was right. He was ruined for the same thing. But as the midnight fog rolled in, he felt a strange flickering thought, the first original thought he had possessed in years. If he couldn't be a gear in someone else's machine, he would have to find a way to be the steam.
The fever took hold by the 3rd day of Elias's exile. It was a shivering, hallucinatory heat that made the walls of his tiny rented room pulse like the bellows of a furnace. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his mind trapped in a loop. Left, clear. Right, flick. His body refused to believe it was free. Even in his delirium, his good hand clawed at the air, trying to catch a phantom lever that was no longer there. When the fever finally broke, it left him hollow and dangerously thin. His last penny was gone, paid to the landlady to keep her from throwing his broken body into the gutter. He was starving. The hunger wasn't just a stomach cramp, it was a thief, stealing the very muscles he had built over years of toil. He dragged himself out into the sunlight, real sunlight, pale and weak, and realized he could no longer afford to be a man of pride. He had to become a mudlark of the industrial age. Elias headed for the iron graveyards behind the railway terminuses. This was where the broken things went, rusted boilers, sheared bolts, and the twisted remains of looms that had finally met their end. It was a landscape of jagged metal and oily puddles, populated by the scavengers, men and children who lived by finding the small bits of value the great machines spit out. He began his new job. It was different from the mill, yet hauntingly familiar.
He walked the length of the scrap heaps, bending over to pick up bits of brass and copper. Bend, grab, bag. Bend, grab, bag. It was another repetition, another cycle. But here, there was no steam engine to set the pace. If his arm throbbed, he could sit on a rusted gear and rest. If he saw a bird, he could watch it until it vanished into the smog. It was a slow, agonizing freedom. "You're doing it wrong," a voice croaked. Elias looked up to see an old woman sitting atop a pile of iron shavings. She was wrapped in layers of burlap, her face so covered in grease she looked like a statue carved from coal. She was sorting through a pile of discarded pins. "Doing what wrong?" Elias asked, his voice still raspy from the fever. "The rhythm," she said, her hands moving with a terrifying speed. "Pick, sort, drop. Pick, sort, drop. You're fighting it. You're trying to think about every piece you pick up. Don't think. Just let your hand be the magnet. If you think, the day lasts 1,000 years. If you don't, it's over in a blink." Elias felt a chill. Even here, in the trash heaps of the empire, the same thing was the only way to survive. The repetition wasn't just a factory requirement, it was a human survival mechanism. To endure the unbearable, one had to become unthinking. "I spent 20 years at the furnaces, opening and closing the door, 6,000 times a shift. My eyes are scorched, and my lungs are ash. Now I do this. It's the same motion, just smaller. We're all born to be a certain kind of clock, lad. You just haven't found your gears yet." Elias looked at the brass bolt in his hand. He didn't want to be a clock. He didn't want his life to be a series of identical seconds. But as his stomach roared in protest, he went back to the motion. Bend, grab, bag. By evening, he had collected enough scrap to earn a few halfpennies from the local dealer. As he walked back through the city, he passed a shop window he usually ignored. It was a clockmaker's shop. Inside, dozens of timepieces ticked in a chaotic, beautiful disharmony. He saw a skeleton clock, a device where all the internal gears were exposed, polished and shining. He watched the escapement wheel. It moved with the same left-right motion of his loom. But here, the motion was purposeful. It wasn't making silk. It was holding time. It was creating something invisible and precious. He touched the glass of the window. He realized that the problem wasn't the repetition. The world was built on repetition, the tides, the heartbeat, the rising of the sun. The problem was the purpose. In the mill, his repetition was used to erase him. Here, in the clock, the repetition was used to define the world. He looked at his broken arm, still bound in the dirty splint. He realized he didn't just want to survive, he wanted to understand the pulse. That night, for the first time, he didn't dream of the loom. He dreamed of gears of light and a rhythm that he chose for himself. But the next morning, the 4:30 bell rang in the distance, a reminder that the maw was still hungry, and it didn't care about his dreams. It only cared about his hands. The rain in Manchester had a way of turning the world into a smudge of charcoal and lead. For Elias, the days following his realization at the clockmaker's window were a blur of cold hunger and mechanical ghosts. He continued his work as a scavenger, his bend, grab, bag rhythm becoming a hollow imitation of his time at the loom. But his mind was no longer at the bottom of a scrap heap. He was watching. He began to notice the subtle differences in the iron he collected. He learned the weight of a sheared bolt from a spinning jenny versus the density of a valve from a high-pressure boiler. He was learning the anatomy of the city's industry through its waste. He was no longer just a repeater. He was becoming a reader of the machine's failures. One Tuesday, while digging through a pile of slag near the Irwell River, Elias found something that didn't belong. It was a heavy brass cylinder, intricately engraved with a series of numerical codes. It wasn't broken or worn. It looked like it had been discarded by mistake, a vital organ tossed out with the skin. "That's a regulator sleeve," a voice boomed behind him. Elias spun around, his heart jumping. Standing on the muddy bank was a man he recognized all too well. It wasn't Grissom, but someone far more powerful, Mr. Blackwood's chief engineer, a man named Silas Vane. Vane was a towering figure in a soot-stained leather apron, his arms thick as tree trunks and covered in the scars of steam burns. It was in the slag, sir," Elias stammered, clutching the brass cylinder. Vane stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Elias's splinted arm and then at the cylinder. "That sleeve is the reason Loom 42 is sitting silent. The fools in the maintenance shed couldn't find it. They assumed it had shattered and thrown the pieces into the river." Elias looked at the brass. Station 42, his station, the machine that had broken his arm, was silent because of this one piece of metal. "You're the one," Vane said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The element who broke the rhythm in front of the London investors. Grissom said you were a clumsy drunk, but a drunk doesn't have the eyes to find a needle in a haystack of rust." "I'm not a drunk, sir," Elias said, his voice gaining a sudden sharp edge. "I was a clock, and the clock skipped a second." Vane stared at him for a long moment. The wind whistled through the jagged iron of the graveyard. "The mill is a monster, Thorne. It eats people and spits out silk. I've seen men do the same motion for 40 years until they forgot their own names. But you look like you're trying to remember something." Vane reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver shilling, more money than Elias had seen in weeks. He tossed it into the mud at Elias's feet. "Bring that sleeve to the back gate of the foundry tonight. Not the mill, the foundry, 9 p.m. "Why?" Elias asked. "Because the master wants the loom running by morning," Vane said, turning away. "And I want to see if a man who spent 3 years doing one thing can learn to do 100. Elias picked up the shilling. It was cold and heavy. For the rest of the day, the bend, grab, bag felt different. The repetition had a destination. He wasn't just surviving, he was moving toward a gear he didn't yet understand. As 9 p.m. approached, the black fog returned, thicker than ever. Elias stood at the foundry gate, the brass cylinder tucked under his good arm. The foundry was the dark heart of the Blackwood Empire. If the mill was where the silk was made, the foundry was where the machines were born. It was a place of fire, molten orange light, and the rhythmic thud of massive trip hammers that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Vane opened the small wicket door. Inside, quick. The heat was staggering. It made the humidity of the mill feel like a spring breeze. Huge crucibles of molten iron swung overhead on rattling chains, dripping sparks like liquid stars. Here the repetition was different. It wasn't the frantic, high-speed twitching of the textile looms. It was the slow, tectonic pulse of the forge. Strike, turn, cool. Strike, turn, cool. "Clean it," Vane commanded, pointing to a workbench covered with specialized tools, files, calipers, and polishing stones. "The sleeve is scored. If we put it back in the loom like that, it'll seize in an hour. You spent 3 years touching that lever. You know how it should feel. Make it feel right." Elias sat at the bench. He picked up a fine grit file. For a moment, his hand hesitated. He was used to a 1-second cycle. This task required patience. It required him to look at the metal, not through it. He began to work. Stroke, check, stroke, check. It was a new rhythm. It was slower, more deliberate.
As he filed away the burrs on the brass, he realized he could feel the imperfections through the tool. His years of repetitive labor had not just dulled his mind, they had sensitized his touch. He knew the vibration of the machine better than any man who had designed it. Hours passed. The foundry workers moved like shadows around him, their movements synchronized with the pouring of the metal. Elias was lost in the brass. He was fixing the very thing that had destroyed his life. "Done," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the furnaces. Vane stepped over and picked up the cylinder. He ran a blackened fingernail over the surface. It was as smooth as glass. The engineer looked at Elias, a strange glint in his eye. "You have the hands of a repeater, Thorne, but the eyes of a maker. Most men who do what you did for 3 years lose the ability to see the detail. They only see the blur." "I saw the bird," Elias said. "What?" "In the rafters, before the accident. I saw a bird trying to get out." Vane grunted. "In here, the only way out is through the chimney, and that's a path for smoke, not birds. But listen to me. The loom is being reassembled. Grissom wants you blacklisted. He wants you in the workhouse. But I need a man who knows the vibration of the machines before they break. A listener." "I can't go back to the line," Elias said. "I'm not putting you on the line. I'm putting you under it. You'll be a greaser, a scavenger of sound. You'll walk the shafts and the belts. You'll do the same walk every day, every hour. But instead of flicking a lever, you'll be looking for the skip in the heartbeat. You'll be the ghost in the gears." It was another job of repetition, another cycle of the same thing. But as Elias looked at the glowing crucibles, he realized the difference. He wouldn't be part of the machine anymore. He would be its doctor. "I'll do it," Elias said. "Good. 4:30 a.m., back gate. And Thorne, if you see a bird tomorrow, ignore it. The machines don't like witnesses." Elias walked out into the night. The bell would ring in 4 hours. The cycle would begin again. But as he looked at the soot-stained sky, he didn't feel like a gear. He felt like the steam.
At 4:30 a.m., the world was a bruising shade of indigo. Elias did not enter through the main gates of the Blackwood Mill with the tidal wave of weary souls. Instead, he slipped through the heavy iron door of the foundry, where the air smelled of scorched earth and cooling slag. Silas Vane was waiting, holding a long-necked oil can and a heavy, serrated wrench. "The line starts in 10 minutes, Vane said, his voice echoing in the hollow belly of the building. "Up there, they live by the second. Down here, we live by the friction. If a bearing runs dry, the friction creates heat. Heat creates expansion. Expansion creates a wreck. Your job is to ensure the maw never gets a fever." Vane led him to a trapdoor in the floor. Below lay the drive gallery, a narrow subterranean tunnel that ran the entire length of the mill, directly beneath the rows of looms. It was a forest of spinning iron. Massive horizontal shafts, some as thick as a man's waist, roared with a terrifying centrifugal force. Overhead, thousands of leather belts lunged through slots in the ceiling to power the machines above. The noise was different here. It wasn't the clatter of shuttles. It was the deep, guttural growl of the earth being torn apart. "This is your circuit," Vane shouted over the roar. "Station 1 to Station 100. You walk it. You oil the journals. You feel the housings for heat. Then you start over. By the time you reach 100, Station 1 needs you again. It never ends." Elias stepped into the dark. The floor was slick with a century's worth of accumulated grease and lint. He began his new rhythm. Walk, lean, oil. Walk, touch, check. It was the same thing, over and over, in a space so cramped he had to keep his head bowed. But as he moved, he
He realized he was seeing the mill from the perspective of its entrails. Above him, he could hear the rhythmic thud of the looms. He could hear the ghost of his own station, Station 42, beating like a drum. Thud, clack, thud, clack. He reached up and touched the underside of the floorboards. He could feel the vibrations of the workers' feet. He could tell by the weight of the step who was tired, who was pacing, and who was standing still in a trance. He was a shadow beneath their world, a silent guardian of the repetition they endured. By the 4th hour, the heat in the gallery was suffocating. The friction of the shafts generated a dry, static heat that made the hair on his arms stand up. His broken arm, still in its splint, throbbed with every step, but he found a strange solace in the isolation. Down here, there was no grism, there were no investors, there was only the raw, honest power of the steam. As he reached Station 42 from below, he stopped. He looked at the belt that powered his old loom. It was frayed at the edges, the leather screaming as it whipped around the pulley. He reached out with his good hand and applied a thick black tallow to the belt. The screaming stopped, replaced by a satisfied hum. He had just saved the man standing at Station 42 from the very accident that had broken him. He didn't know who the man was, likely one of the desperate souls from the rain-soaked gates, but for a moment Elias felt a sense of godlike agency. By doing his repetitive task perfectly, he was controlling the fate of the people above. But the underworld had its own horrors. In the dark corners of the gallery, he saw the loom rats, children even younger than Toby, whose job was to crawl into the smallest gaps where even Elias couldn't fit, picking out the clumps of oil-soaked cotton that could catch fire. They were covered in so much black grease they looked like shadows given form. They didn't speak. They didn't look at him. They were simply part of the lubrication. First time, a voice rasped from the darkness. Elias jumped, his oil can slipping. A man sat in a niche carved into the brickwork. He was ancient, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes clouded with cataracts. He was holding a rhythmic clicking device, a tally counter. "I'm the pulse taker. I count the revolutions. If the engine slows by even 3 turns a minute, the silk loses its sheen, and the master loses a penny. I've been counting for 40 years. 1, 2, 3, click. 1, 2, 3, click." Elias stared at him. "You just count all day?" "The rhythm is the only truth, lad. Everything else is just noise. People come and go, empires fall, but the shaft keeps turning. If you listen close enough, the machine will tell you the future. It'll tell you when it's tired. It'll tell you when it's angry." Elias moved on, the old man's click fading into the roar. He finished his first circuit and began the second. Walk, lean, oil. Walk, touch, check. It was the same thing, over and over, in a space so cramped he had to keep his head bowed. But as he moved, he realized he was seeing the mill from the perspective of its entrails. Above him, he could hear the rhythmic thud of the looms. He could hear the ghost of his own station, Station 42, beating like a drum. Thud, clack, thud, clack. He reached up and touched the underside of the floorboards. He could feel the vibrations of the workers' feet. He could tell by the weight of the step who was tired, who was pacing, and who was standing still in a trance. He was a shadow beneath their world, a silent guardian of the repetition they endured. By the 4th hour, the heat in the gallery was suffocating. The friction of the shafts generated a dry, static heat that made the hair on his arms stand up. His broken arm, still in its splint, throbbed with every step, but he found a strange solace in the isolation. Down here, there was no grism, there were no investors, there was only the raw, honest power of the steam. As he reached Station 42 from below, he stopped. He looked at the belt that powered his old loom. It was frayed at the edges, the leather screaming as it whipped around the pulley. He reached out with his good hand and applied a thick black tallow to the belt. The screaming stopped, replaced by a satisfied hum. He had just saved the man standing at Station 42 from the very accident that had broken him. He didn't know who the man was, likely one of the desperate souls from the rain-soaked gates, but for a moment, Elias felt a sense of godlike agency. By doing his repetitive task perfectly, he was controlling the fate of the people above. But the underworld had its own horrors. In the dark corners of the gallery, he saw the loom rats, children even younger than Toby, whose job was to crawl into the smallest gaps where even Elias couldn't fit, picking out the clumps of oil-soaked cotton that could catch fire. They were covered in so much black grease they looked like shadows given form. They didn't speak. They didn't look at him. They were simply part of the lubrication. "First time?" a voice rasped from the darkness. Elias jumped, his oil can slipping. A man sat in a niche carved into the brickwork. He was ancient, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes clouded with cataracts. He was holding a rhythmic clicking device, a tally counter. "I'm the pulse taker. I count the revolutions. If the engine slows by even 3 turns a minute, the silk loses its sheen, and the master loses a penny. I've been counting for 40 years. 1, 2, 3, click. 1, 2, 3, click." Elias stared at him. "You just count all day?" "The rhythm is the only truth, lad. Everything else is just noise. People come and go, empires fall, but the shaft keeps turning. If you listen close enough, the machine will tell you the future. It'll tell you when it's tired. It'll tell you when it's angry." Elias moved on, the old man's click fading into the roar. He finished his first circuit and began the second. Walk, lean, oil. Walk, touch, check. It was the same thing over and over in a space so cramped he had to keep his head bowed. But as he moved, he realized he was seeing the mill from the perspective of its entrails. Above him, he could hear the rhythmic thud of the looms. He could hear the ghost of his own station, Station 42, beating like a drum. Thud, clack, thud, clack. He reached up and touched the underside of the floorboards. He could feel the vibrations of the workers' feet. He could tell by the weight of the step who was tired, who was pacing, and who was standing still in a trance. He was a shadow beneath their world, a silent guardian of the repetition they endured. By the 4th hour, the heat in the gallery was suffocating. The friction of the shafts generated a dry, static heat that made the hair on his arms stand up. His broken arm, still in its splint, throbbed. The drainage tunnel was a subterranean rib of Manchester, slick with the runoff of 1,000 industrial sins. Elias crawled through the darkness, the smell of sulfur and old grease filling his lungs. For hours, he moved in a new, cramped rhythm, push, slide, breathe, until the tunnel finally vomited him out onto the muddy banks of the River Irwell. The city was different in the daylight. The Blackwood Mill's chimney, usually a pillar of roiling black smoke, stood impotent and cold against the gray sky. A strange, eerie stillness had settled over the Ancoats district. Thousands of workers stood in the streets, huddled in small groups. They weren't cheering. They were staring at their hands, their fingers still twitching in the phantom patterns of their labor. Without the machine to dictate their movements, they looked like marionettes with their strings cut. Elias moved through the shadows, his heavy coat collar turned up. He made his way to the narrow street where the clockmaker's shop stood. The window was still filled with the intricate, ticking skeletons of time. He pushed the door open. A bell chimed, a clean, musical note that made Elias flinch. The shop was a sanctuary of a different kind of repetition. Here, the sounds were tiny, precise, and purposeful. "We are closed for the stoppage," a voice called from the back. "There is no point in fixing a watch when the city's heart has stopped." Elias sent me, his voice sounding like gravel. An old man emerged from behind a velvet curtain. He was small and wiry, with a jeweler's loop pushed up onto his forehead like a third eye. He looked at Elias's grease-stained clothes, his splinted arm, and the haunted clarity in his eyes. "So, you're the one who broke the law," the clockmaker said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I am Eris Thorn. No relation, I assume, though perhaps we share a lineage of the spirit. Vane told me a listener might arrive." Elias just said, "I'm just a repeater who stopped." "Is that what you think?" Eris walked to a workbench and picked up a tiny brass gear, no larger than a grain of sand. "The men at the mill, they are slaves to the cylindrical time, the infinite, meaningless loop. But a clockmaker, we deal in linear time. Every tick of a well-made watch is a step toward a destination. The mill uses repetition to erase the man. I use repetition to honor the second." Eris pointed to a massive clock on the wall, its pendulum swinging with a slow, majestic grace. "You understand the vibration of the iron, Elias. I can see it in the way you hold your breath. You were the grease in the gears. Now I need you to be the soul of the escapement." Elias whispered, "I don't know how to make things. I only know how to keep them from failing." "In this age of steam and fury, that is the same thing," Eris replied. He cleared a space on a secondary workbench. "Your job is no longer to do the same thing all day. Your job is to ensure that no 2 seconds are ever lost. You will clean the movements of the chronometers. You will feel the tension in the mainsprings. You will do it over and over until you can hear the difference between a second that is true and a second that is lying." Elias looked at the tools, fine tweezers, tiny screwdrivers, jars of translucent oil. It was a new world of repetition. Pick, dip, place. Pick, dip, place. As he began his first day under Eris's tutelage, the silence of the city outside began to bleed into the shop. But it wasn't the heavy, terrifying silence of the drive gallery. It was a quietness filled with potential. For the first time in his life, Elias wasn't working to feed a machine. He was working to measure the life of a man. But as the sun set, a shadow passed the shop window. It was a group of knockers-ups, men usually hired to wake workers for the 4:30 a.m. shift. Now they were carrying torches and placards. The desperation of the stoppage was turning into a simmer of unrest. "They are looking for the saboteur," Eris said, watching the crowd. "The master has offered a 5-pound reward. In this neighborhood, a man would sell his own mother for 5 pounds. Elias looked at his hands. They were steady. The flick and clear was fading, replaced by the delicate tension of the watch spring. He had found a new rhythm, but the old world was not done with him yet. The maw was hungry, and it wanted its ghost back.